Traditions channel. Welcome to the Plated Traditions channel with your host Kendra Moses. This is the Plated Traditions channel.
Hello and welcome to the Plated Traditions channel. My name is Kendra Moses, and as always, our resident chef Kai off camera. So today we're going to touch up again on the topic of tradition, and this will happen quite frequently, to be honest, because we're playing traditions. But today we're talking about the concept of tradition and the concept of history. It's often said that history repeats itself, and for good reason. We see a lot of accounts throughout our day-to-day lives that are very reminiscent, if not basic doppelgangers, as sorts of events. It's when the old phrase goes, it seems like it was only yesterday. We have to really think and dwell into the notion and the thought process of, did it just seem like it happened yesterday, or did pretty much the exact same thing happen yesterday that happened probably many years ago? Now, from the Play Traditions point of view, we view traditions as a basic premise of history. It's basically your culture's or your family's direct history. And I know history, it can be a very debated upon thing, because it's only really history if it's been recorded. But with our new age of technology and everything else, everything has been recorded. It just hasn't been recorded so much so probably in the way that it used to be when the word history first came to be. So we're not thinking about graphite on some sort of mulched tree that turned into paper. We're thinking about pictures. We're thinking about type. We're thinking about anything that holds an account of what has happened to us in our lives. And we think about it chronologically, we can at least loosely go ahead and declare it our history. We mentioned before that tradition can have a pretty unique meaning to each and every person. And I mentioned before that tradition, when I was coming up, started to get a bit of a bad rap. And I know why, because there's this sense of being held to account for someone else's life, for someone else's train of thought. So I understood where people was coming from, but if it was something about your basic tradition process, where encounters that you experienced that you said, this means something to me, actually hold reverence for it, not contempt. And that's what we're going for at Plated Traditions. We want an account, or help you build an account where you're seeing the history of your life, of your family's life, your lineage, your friends, whoever made it a part of your life and has been over a course of time. So, and thus in your past from this point on, so thus being basically loosely a part of your history. And that's where we feel that a tradition is by the most basic definition, your history is very intertwined. There's this feeling, I do know, that when you think about tradition and you think about history, when it says history seems to repeat itself, even that statement is not always said in the most pleasant of terms. I believe every single generation out there has had some sort of feeling, unfortunately a negative feeling for events that have happened throughout the history. But again, like we try to surmise when we talk about your Plated Traditions and making sure you're having things incorporated that means something good to you and pleasant to you. Because not all of your tradition, hopefully, not all of your tradition was bad. There had to be some good, some silver lining that you said that I'm going to hold this with me. I'm going to keep this with me and cherish it. If it is the only thing. when we're talking about cherishing something, we're talking about a tradition. We're not talking about what would look good or how many paragraphs it will cover in the next internet article, or if we're still using them, the next book, to the next magazine, what have you, to hold your customs aloft with pride and dignity. We're talking about the simple day-to-day things that may never make it onto anyone else's scale but you and your families. But that's all that matters, because we're talking about things on an individual basis. So if we're talking about a tradition that way, and if we're going to go ahead and concede to say that a tradition is actually a part of your history, we cannot say that everything in history was bad either. And even without all that added explanation or the trying to tweak a thought process and tying in history with traditions, there are things out there that might have been not the most pleasant situations throughout history, but for so many things that have happened throughout our history, if they did not happen, it would be a much bleaker world. Even down to the forgetfulness of a scientist who left out his petri dishes and came back to find that the bacteria was gone in one petri dish. But he found out he had penicillin. He found out he had a cure. And then we found out these things can actually be found even in moldy bread. The cells that can mimic or become penicillin, the things that keep you alive and keep you as healthy as possible, even though it may not look all that great. So we want to make sure that we don't completely cast everything aside. We are in an age, and basically I believe our species has always been in an age of wanting a sense of originality, wanting a sense of a personal feeling of uniqueness and oneness. So much so that, at least here where I'm from in the United States, our very First Amendment is basically the right of free expression. And we end up taking that amendment and translating it any way we see fit, sometimes to the purpose of a day-to-day life that's not negatively or positively affecting anyone. It's just a you thing. And there's some things out there that do cause positive effects for even outside your realm of your life. And then, of course, as with everything in life, there are some other questionable things that end up seeming to test the fold of what we call originality and our free rights and our free will. Basically, a tradition, a good tradition, something that's been recorded throughout the span of your culture, your community, your life, is something that you repeat. It's a basic history that you are seeking to intentionally repeat, even down to grandma's handwritten recipe. That's a part of your lineage. You see that as a part of where you come from, and that's a part of your history. So it may not be a bad thing all the time when we said that history repeats itself. It shows a duplicitous nature and what seemingly a simple statement. And there are many simple statements like this for all different types of examples, and they all have your metaphorical yin and yang, your positive and your negative. It all depends on a personal introspection, and that's what we encourage here on Play Traditions, a personal introspection. But we cannot deny the fact that in the most loosest of words, our traditions are part of our history, a history that we willfully and gleefully repeat. While that statement of history repeating itself may not always have the best connotation when we're just talking about history on its own. So when we start to group ideals and add it to our personal lives, we start to see that there's no real one answer sometimes, and it will be on an independent basis. And this is this basic standpoint of possibly the most authentic originality we're ever going to have. But we end up finding ourselves not being as original as we hope. Our ideas not as groundbreaking as we hope. I again ask you to refer to your tradition, because if it's a tradition that you held with reverence, with pride and honor and dignity, you didn't care it didn't come from you. It was enough that it came from your culture. It was enough that it came from your family. You didn't let that aspect bother you. Nor did you let the aspect or the consideration bother you that something is that was here way before you were born is basically telling you a way of life to live. When you have it like that, you don't see so much of a defiance. You don't feel that defiance because you're not just feeling like something is just being thrown at you to be and do, if you accept it. We think about all the things in our day-to-day lives, and some things happen irregardless whether or not we want them to happen or not. We talk about wanting to be the masters of time. One thing about our species, we want to be the masters of pretty much everything. There's hardly anything out there that we don't want to be some alpha figure for. We want to think that we control our fates. We can influence them, but that's up to our personal introspection. Because trust me, with billions of people on this earth, and you having a finite time, and undoubtedly having a great deal of responsibility to your own life, you will not have the luxury or the privilege to make decisions about other people's lives. And that's where we come to the word mistake. Part of the whole alpha thing about us wanting to be the master of time, master of the fates, master of everything that comes across. Because you want to say you were the first, you were the most influential. And when I mean influential, I'm not even talking about what we're turning it into for the internet or social media. I mean, when people said they were going to make their mark in things, when invention started and industry and everything else came about. And then we come along years later, a lot of these inventions have been around for hundreds of years, and we still want to say that we can do something else, we can make something better. Maybe, but it will almost always be off the heels of things that were already here, things that were already developed. You might make it better, you might make it slightly different, you may change the spelling around of this product to call it your own, but we're still borrowing from that history. Good or bad, we're still borrowing from that history. And as we continue to borrow from that history, we continue to add to our way of life. And our way of life sometimes becomes a part of our traditions. And when we do all these things, with all our differences, with all our originality, we hear the word mistake. And this word may come from someone who may be at a disagreement as to what was their perceived notion of right or wrong, good or bad, or maybe even yourself, because you had made this grandstand notion in your mind that something has to be or look a certain way in order to succeed. When I was coming up and learning to be in the kitchen, my mother told me about what my great-grandmother said. My great-grandmother, lovely woman, lived to almost 100 years old. She tried to teach me poker and everything else. Unfortunately, by the time I came around, she was still alive, and I got to enjoy her company, but by that time and point, being in the kitchen with her was not quite feasible. So her cooking was done for her by her daughter. Nothing wrong with that. So it was great to hear about accounts where my mother had the opportunity to be in the kitchen with my great-grandmother. And my mother was talking about messing up something And my great-grandmother, as the lovely person she was, she said, you only make a mistake when you give it a name. When you go ahead and classify that something is what you at least thought it was going to be or what you were setting out to be. She said, as long as you go through the process, don't name it. Go through the process. And when you have your finished result, do you give it a name? But she said all that to say that name at the end should not ideally be mistake. And I took those words with me. And for some, I know it may seem like a scapegoat attempt, but it really isn't. The biggest things that we do throughout the course of our life, as we make decisions in our mind, either for others or ourselves, that something has to be a specific way. But if you made something that was edible and that you actually enjoyed, but you just can't authentically call something else, you don't have to call it a mistake. Just call it something else. This is a train of thought too for also preserving resources. So we're preserving both your resources and your state of mind. The best way to keep you going at something is to keep you still jubilant and still optimistic about what you're doing. And that was the best way I could see to be optimistic about what I'm doing. We think about these things, but again, we think either more one way or the other. We are always seemingly trying to tip the scale instead of balancing it. And I say all this because mistake. Now, we say sometimes mistakes happen by accident. A lot of times we want to say mistakes happen by accident. I would call a mistake. Actually, that's the actual definition of a mistake, to happen by accident. So a word that is very synonymous with mistake is accident. Now, throughout the course of history, of course, many mistakes/accidents have happened. But these things don't even go into the negative pile when we say history repeats itself. Because there are a lot of foods and a lot of dishes that have come to be that were basically left by regular accident, regular human error, the regular human nature of just forgetting something one day. Like how the oats were left out in a hot climate and it rained. It came out, the oats coupled with the heat of the climate, they had essentially a bowl of porridge. I guess they took a little bite of it. They said, well, this is a good way, a different way to eat something. Now at first, depending on the resources, it was all that they had. That possibly seemed like an incredible mistake, but it was something meant for food, sustenance, and it was still edible. It was still what we call today our oatmeal or porridge. It was a pleasant surprise. It was a pleasant accident. It was a pleasant mistake. It was a mistake that quickly redeemed itself. And so that's where we want to talk about more of on today. All those things, those mistakes that happened throughout the course of history, that now today, you expect them. It's interesting. We are a species that are hell-bent and determined. We don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to be wrong. We don't want to repeat things. And still and yet, these are things that we do, no things that are necessary, but things that you expect now. Because the ironic part of it is, the food dishes and the food products that we get and go to today, they were made by mistake. They were made by accident. And now, if they do it any other way than that accident, you will tell them as a consumer that they made a mistake, that they messed up everything. And depending if it was your last bit of meal or depending on how much of a moody or foodie you get, they even say they messed up your life because they did something differently. So now, if they do anything to change that mistake, it's called a mistake. Now, there are quite a few examples of food like this. So if you think about things like plums and grapes, there are things that grow out, and sometimes when the harvest comes, or sometimes when you just see things grow, you don't just take everything off the vine. You don't take everything off the branch. You leave some things there, and you just basically go as you eat. For the most part, we're just saying the tree is our storage. The vines are our storage. Always have been. Let's just say it that way. And then you notice one day that you didn't get to the grapes in time. They just shrivel up to these things. But the interesting thing I find is that sense of wonder still. Someone had to still pluck it and give it a bit of a taste. I mean, you know what a grape tastes like. The simple curiosity of looking at this shriveled up grape, this dried grape, and you eat it, and it's sweet, possibly even sweeter than the grape was. It has just a little bit of moisture, and for all intents and purposes, no foul taste. It's rather tasty. It still seems very edible. So it became something out of what was called a mistake for something that wasn't picked from the tree soon enough, that was just left out. And it's something that we no longer wait for either. We don't wait for ourselves personally. We don't wait for the grapes to dry up on the vine. No, we want to go to a store. And we're going to go to a store where someone else has done it, and someone else who has mass marketed this and really increased that process. So we can quickly have as many raisins as we want to. If we are told we're getting a raisin, we do not want to receive a grape. We would tell that person that they made a mistake, irregardless that the raisin had to come from a grape at one point in time. Now, another example of things coming to be by accident, or we'll loosely say by mistake. Now, one of the most hard pronounced words or condiments out there is Worcestershire sauce. It's Worcestershire sauce. And feel free to come after me if you still don't think I pronounced it right. We're gonna go on with this video. But it's a very popular condiment, not just for its difficulty in pronouncing and catching people off by the pronunciation alone. So it kind of has that as a trend within itself, or a habit that it instills in people. Because this was produced by two chemists. And so I'm not quite sure, to be honest, I'm not quite sure these chemists often participated in Epicurean dealings, but they had a request. Like so often, and it's basically the basis of our traditions. Someone had a taste of something. A former governor of Bengal came back to England, and like so many other food discoveries, you try something at a different country, you encounter things that just aren't frequently seen where you're from or where you're going to. So again, like so many of us in this day and age, we don't all have chemists to go to, but what we do try to do is we try to replicate that flavor, that taste, that texture. That's essentially what we're doing for everything. If you're going by a recipe, if you're going by your family's traditional meal, you're basically doing everything in your power to replicate it. He was able to call on John Lee and William Perrins. These two chemists did their scientific deed, but they weren't quite happy with what they produced from the attempted replications. For all intents and purposes, in their mind, they made a mistake. It just didn't come out, so it really wasn't worth really giving it any more of their time. But luckily enough for them, even though they felt like it didn't match the original job they were asked to do, that original flavor that they were trying to extrapolate from the sample, they didn't throw it away. They just put it off to the side and forget about it. Like so many other things, when we lose random things, just stumble across it again, whether we're looking for it or not. But during that time, what they initially created had time to mature and to end up having a richer and more complex flavor. So now what was a discarded figment of a mistake in their eyes is now a product that they proudly have their names on bottles across the world. And the interesting thing about being a cook, I will tell you, when you find out that certain way, when you realize that it did make a difference of you having it on a certain heat or doing it a certain way or letting it sit for a certain amount of minutes or hours or days, you make sure to have that hard pressed in your head. And every single time that you attempt to make something or to make that specific thing, whatever it may be, you do that. And it is amazing to me to think that two chemists are doing the exact same thing. So it went from a favor or a request, maybe a job request of them, to creating something from what they deem to be a mistake. But the thing is, without them thinking they made a mistake and casting it aside, it would have never had the chance to mature. Now, granted, it also was, like I said, a very good thing they did not just cast their mistake completely away and just threw it out. But if it wasn't for that initial process of thinking that something wasn't right and the actual serendipity nature of still having it there and coming back to it at just the right time. So now they know a base point for time about how long it would take for them to achieve that flavor again. And it's something that I'm sure as scientists, they had hard pressed in their head from that day on. And now it's a very popular brand still around the world. So sometimes a mistake doesn't have to be all that bad. We're in the 1800s now in Australia. So again, we're a species that thinks that kind of off the way places may not have all that much to offer. And I guess Australia is one of those places because it was originally just used to really get rid of people, essentially. And I find that interesting because it's a very prosperous and well-developed country now. So the whole thing about history and tradition and what we think to be a mistake or outcast ends up producing some really great things. But it all takes time, and it all depends on how we use that time and those resources around it, or seeing the value in something regardless of how it's initially seen. So in the 1860s with Maria Ann Smith, and we're in Australia, there was a interesting seedling that started growing amongst the crab apple cores and pits that just been discarded over to the side. I'm not sure for curiosity or possible necessity, she decided to cultivate it. But when she cultivated it, it didn't come up as a crab apple. What she ended up cultivating was actually what we know today of as a Granny Smith apple. The Granny Smith apple really wasn't much known for and could have easily went extinct at any point in time if it wasn't for this discovery. The thing about anything in this life, everything needs to actually exist in order to be not only history, to not only be tradition, but to be of everything that we know and practice today. And some things on this earth, yeah, they get here, they end up growing, but they don't always end up surviving. So it's a great thing that this curiosity, this necessity, whatever the reason was, but this woman single-handedly, if you wanted to use the grandstand notion, saved and helped bring to attention to a species of apple that was different than the rest, had its own originality and uniqueness. That same originality and uniqueness that we as a species try to get from our day-to-day lives amongst each other. They did it amongst a pile of cores from crab apples. And this little seedling decided to grow. And because of her interest and because of her attention, she cultivated and discovered a new form of life, our Granny Smith apple. Back to the words of my great-grandmother. You don't necessarily, you can call it whatever you want. If it's still edible, if it's still usable, workable. First thing that you do when you make something a bit different, find something a bit different, see something a bit different, you don't have to automatically call it a mistake. In fact, these are great examples that you should not. You just have to do what she says. Just go ahead and call it something else. So just keep that in mind as you go along your culinary arts journey.
Traditions music.
Kitchen. I'm a culinary artist with ambition. You can call it what you want, but I'm not listening. I'm not calling it a mistake just because your plate's not glistening. I don't make no mistakes in my kitchen. Did I tell you what I was mixing? So how do you know what I was fixing? I don't label my food, but baby, mine's on a mission. Because you only make a mistake if I get a name before I fix it. There's never been no mistakes in my kitchen. I'm a culinary artist with ambition. You can call it what you want, but I'm not listening. I'm not calling it a mistake just because your plate's not glistening. I don't make no mistakes in my kitchen. Did I tell you what I was mixing? So how do you know what I was fixing? I don't label my food, many mine's on a mission. Because you only make a mistake if I give it a name before I fix it. I fix it. Because you only make a mistake if I get a name before I fix it. I give a name before I fix it. There's never been no mistakes in my kitchen. I'm a culinary artist with ambition. You can call it what you want, but I'm not listening. I'm not calling it a mistake just because your plate's not glistening.
Thank you again for joining us for another week. We hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.